This room looks very different from up here. Usually I'm out there. All right, we are going to rip this Band-Aid off really quickly and get the hard stuff out of the way, and I promise we will move on to better things. I'm standing in front of you today because I was hit by a car really, really hard. And spoiler alert, I lived to tell the story. Now, usually when this comes up in conversation, I get like a variety of super awkward responses. Either people freeze up because they actually want to ask me a lot of questions, but they don't want to make me feel uncomfortable, or I get an awkward glance or a sympathetic glance, or I can watch the wheels turn as people start to assess whether I have something visibly or invisibly wrong with me. Or my favorite is total incredulity. Because honestly, at this point, this many years later, when I stop and think about it, I still cannot believe that this random, horrible thing happened to me. Who gets hit by a car? So in case you're the person who froze and wants to know all the details but feels uncomfortable asking, I'm just going to beat you to the point, and we'll do my brief FAQ, and I promise we'll move on to happier things. On the morning of Tuesday, November 13th, 2018, I was walking to work in Portsmouth. My husband, our 2-year-old son, and I were living in Port Walk Place temporarily while our house was being renovated, so my 1-mile commute got shrunk to 2 long blocks. It was a gray, somewhat drizzly day. It was the Tuesday after Veterans Day, and it was quiet. I literally remember stopping and thinking to myself, it's weirdly quiet this morning as I walked. And if you're a local, you know the place where I crossed the street, on Hanover, between Springer's Jewelers and the Atrezzi parking lot. Real quick, was I in the crosswalk? I'm a rule follower, yes. Was I on my phone? No, I was carrying my coffee, I was running through my to-do list, and also I'm a stickler for being on time, so I was trying to get to work as quickly as I could. Did I look both ways? Rule follower. I saw no cars coming, and I stepped into the road. As I walked, I did see a car coming out of the left eye, but they were so far away that I thought surely it was not an issue. I had time to get to the other side of the road, and surely that driver saw me. And then this is when things get really spotty. The memories come in flashes. I remember seeing a fender hit my knees. I remember darkness and really bright flashes of light and feeling like I was conscious every other second. I remember sitting on the side of the road with a stranger standing over me telling me she had called an ambulance and was going to take my boots off to make sure my legs were okay. Side note, many months later, I found out that stranger, the first person on the scene after I'd been hit, happened to be, call it coincidence or whatever you want, happened to be the chiropractor for the U.S. Olympic bobsled and skeleton teams. So there literally could not have been too many better people to get me out of that road. I remember being very angry with her because she would not stop talking and I needed to go to work. And then things get really, really spotty. Until I remember being wheeled through a hospital corridor, being referred to as Jane Doe. I remember hearing my husband's voice, half crying, half singing Angel from Montgomery, which is a shared favorite song. I remember opening my eyes and seeing our priest standing over my hospital bed praying and thinking, well, that's weird. And that if I closed my eyes again, maybe it would go away. And then I woke up and my life was suddenly very, very different. I had been rushed to the hospital and put in a medically induced coma. The room I woke up in was the ICU. They did not know if I would wake up, and if I did, what kind of brain function I would have. Essentially, when I was hit by the car in that crosswalk, my body had hit the hood of the vehicle. The driver had, understandably, I would have too, freaked out, slammed on the brakes, and because of that, my body flew forward, hit the pavement hard, and then, no joke, I bounced. My body took quite a hit, but my head took the worst of it. So imagine a skull bouncing on the pavement. When a brain takes that kind of blow, Any number of things can happen, and you're not here for a medical lesson. But here was my list of diagnoses. Actually, before I do this, are there any neurologists in the room? Okay, you're stuck with me. Acute subdural hematoma. Really bad brain bleed, is my translation. Acute cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. Basically when the blood can't get out of your brain even though you're hemorrhaging. Basilar skull fracture. Traumatic epidural hematoma. Another bad brain bleed. Acute alteration in mental status. That one's my favorite because it's just kind of funny. Headache due to trauma. Also a favorite because, yeah, I had a really bad headache. Non-displaced fracture of the proximal fibula, microtrabecular fracture of the tibial plateau, contusion of the medial tibial plateau, sprained ACL, least of my worries. So the area of my brain that was affected is right back here. It affects memory, language, and your ability to sequence and organize actions. So think about trying to complete a recipe. That's the temporal lobe that's required to make that happen. So when a skull hits the pavement at the speed mine did, it fractures and tears blood vessels or maybe even arteries, creating a bleed between the skull and the dura mater, the membrane that covers your brain. That blood creates a pocket, and the swelling puts pressure on your brain and exacerbates what is already a terrible injury. So that's my brain. I know it looks great. I actually had to call the hospital to get these images of my brain. They only give them to you on CD. No computers have CDs anymore. So even getting this was a journey. But it looks like a brain, right? What you see at the very bottom is like a shadow or a ghost, and that's the bleed in my brain. So you can see it's like, you know, a quarter of a third of that brain. I was very lucky that they did not have to open up my skull to relieve the pressure that my bleed was putting on the brain. But my neurologist made it pretty clear that literally a hair more, he said that's a quote, and they would have. He told me it was a miracle I was alive. He told me that a lot. All the doctors did. And it took me a long time to believe them. It actually took me until I saw this photo to believe them. And if you're local and you know that crosswalk, you understand there's that parking meter in the left corner. Next time you're over there, look at the distance between the parking meter and the crosswalk, and you'll understand the distance traveled. I was a zombie. I felt like someone had wrapped me in 3 layers of foam, and I was processing the world through those layers. Like someone would say something to me and I'd wait, and then a few seconds later I'd understand what they were saying to me. And I would form a sentence and I'd have to fight it through the foam to communicate out. My memories of the time are really fuzzy, so what I know is thanks to my husband's watchfulness. I really don't know what I would have done without him, and some hospital paperwork. After several days in the ICU, I was moved to a normal people hospital floor. And then I was sent home, and that's when the journey to heal really began for me. It's a very nice Easter dress, just saying. Thanks, Mom. But before we get there, you need to know a few things about me so you have a bit of context for this recovery story. I'm a classic first child overachiever. I'm stubborn. I like being right. If astrology means anything to you, I have serious big Capricorn energy. I am used to being in control of myself, of my presence, of situations, of my work. I have been told I am a very nice, bossy person. In 2015, I started my business, Stout Heart, because I was tired of taking orders that I didn't agree with. We're a mission-driven marketing agency. We work with brands who do good in the world. At the time of my accident, the agency was 3 years old, and every payroll felt like a nail biter. I was stressed and anxious all the time. Side note, my husband and I found out we were pregnant with our first child 3 months after starting the business, just to add another layer of stress to everything. 10 out of 10, do not recommend if you can avoid it. It was not a good time to be out of the office for a sick day, not to mention a long period of healing. At this point in my life, I was a business owner, but I didn't feel good enough. And I was a parent, but I didn't feel present enough. And to me, Anything but clear success meant I was a failure. Here's what is generally accepted as the stages of recovery after a brain injury. And I think it's important to pause and note here that no single brain is alike and no single brain injury is alike. I am not an expert on brain injury because I have one. There's a very dear friend of mine over in this corner who had a very different kind of brain injury. They can run the gamut of things. I was very lucky that I did not have to pause in too many of these stages in my recovery. Honestly, my embarrassment levels couldn't have handled confused and inappropriate. I didn't have major mobility issues, and my verbal skills were mostly intact, even if I was a little slow. And very quickly after my accident, I could check most of the boxes that would point to being fully healed. I still dealt with, and sometimes still do, memory issues, sequencing issues, and brain fog. And just a note on brain fog, the brain injury community calls any folks who have not had a brain injury normies. When normies talk about brain fog, it's an entirely different thing than when brain injury survivors talk about brain fog. Different beast. Put it on steroids, and that's what we experience. I was walking, talking, rational, and on the surface, I seemed pretty normal. After a month and a half of rest, my CT scans showed that the swelling in my brain had normalized, and the neurologist assistant literally choked up when he told me that I was going to be okay to return to normal life. I quickly began to transition back to full-time work. But what you don't see acknowledged in these stages is the emotional toll that injury takes. Physically, any doctor would consider me recovered or at least well on my way. And the overachiever in me was super proud of that. But inside my brain was a mess. I had so many questions. I had always believed that everything happens for a reason. Call it the universe or God or the order of things or whatever it means to you. But how do you reconcile the belief that everything happens for a reason with a traumatic near-death experience? Why me? What does it mean? If everything happens for a reason, what the hell was the reason? My life felt like it had suddenly been divided between pre-brain injury Mariah and post-brain injury Mariah. I did not realize it at the time. It actually took me like 3 years to sort this out for myself. But I was no longer sitting in these brain injury recovery stages. Instead, I was sitting solidly in the stages, whoop, that's not it, of grief. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, but I've given this a lot of time and thought. We look at injury as a physical trauma, but rarely do we acknowledge that physical trauma is also its own form of emotional trauma. And emotional trauma generally needs its own healing process. No one at the hospital prepared me for that. It's not surprising that human beings assume that if you look normal, you're fine. We've made great strides in acknowledging the importance of mental health, but saying that you know that and putting it into practice is an entirely different thing. Also, as a person, I have always done everything in my power to hide vulnerability. I do not like when the cracks in my armor show, but sometimes it turns out that is not under your control. As I moved through these stages of grief, I stalled in depression. I did not realize I was depressed until I was pretty deep in it, and I had never been depressed, so I did not recognize the feeling. I would sit rocking my beautiful 2-year-old son to sleep. Sorry, I knew that was coming. And quietly cry so that I would not wake him up. Rock and cry, rock and cry. I could not explain the way that I felt. Things weren't good, but they weren't bad either, right? Like I had survived, I was alive, and I knew that I was loved. People crawled out of the woodwork to help us during that time. Just, credit to this community. If you ever want a reminder of what a wonderful place you live, get hurt really badly. But why couldn't I be joyful? Why did I feel so numb? Why didn't I feel alive? Why was I suddenly questioning even the value of my own life? The value of my own life that my body had just fought so hard to recover. As an overachiever and someone who was used to being able to take charge of situations to fix them, I was turned on my head, pun intended, by the fact that I could not seem to solve this problem or fix the issue. I was at a loss, and it was getting worse by the day. It was not until totally randomly I saw on social media a post about depression after brain injury that I put two and two together, and then went down an internet rabbit hole. I'm really good at internet rabbit holes. The studies show that a significant number of brain injury survivors grapple with depression afterward. One study even goes so far as to say that 50% of brain injury survivors struggle with depression in the first year after their injury, and up to 2/3 will be affected by it in the 7 years following their injury, compared to 1/10 of the regular population. I did the best thing that I've probably ever done for myself, and I got myself to a therapist real quick. And what I learned in that process was how to move into acceptance. I will never be exactly the same person I was when I set foot in that crosswalk. But I also believe that my journey since that day has made me a better person and has allowed me to learn a very difficult lesson. It does not matter why I was hit by a car. There does not have to be a reason. Some days I think there is one, and I think that reason probably changes with time. I bet when I'm 80, I'll tell you a different reason than what I would tell you today. I think that I've always been a pretty black or white person. You're happy or you're not. You're great or you're not. You're good at something or you're not. I viewed success and happiness in the extreme. If it wasn't perfect, you had not yet achieved it. But the reality is somewhere in the gray area of all of these things. You cannot be perfectly happy and successful or good at something, or at least not all on the same day. And that's okay. At the time, I listened a lot to Kate Bowler's podcast. It's called Everything Happens. I highly recommend it to every human being, but especially if you're a human being who's gone through any kind of trauma. She talks often about the fact that it's okay not to be okay. And that was a message that I truly needed to hear. But if you had tried to get it through to me just a year before, I would not have been receptive. If you cannot learn to accept yourself where you are, your chances at happiness plummet. I always used to be the worst person in every yoga class because I was the person like looking at the person next to me thinking like they can do a handstand and I can't, and maybe I should try. Not a great idea if you can't do a handstand. Or trying to figure out if my form was the best form in the class. That goes against everything yoga's actually about. You're supposed to come as you are and find harmony in your own body. But if you are a competitive overachiever, it's really hard to do that. I literally had to get bonked over the head to understand what it means to come as you are. I find myself saying often that you can only do your best. I see it often at work when we're trying to reason with a client who disagrees with a recommendation. We can present a rational argument, but at the end of the day, we cannot force them to change their mind. I see it even more often in parenting. We do our best to be good parents to our children. There is so much guilt in parenting, especially for moms, but I will save that for a TED Talk someday. We ask if we're doing enough, providing enough, setting a good enough example, but we can only do our best in the moments that we have. Knowing that I could only control a limited number of things, I looked at my life and said, okay, what do I do now? What can I change for the better to improve my own well-being? And honestly, if I hadn't already started Stoutheart and done it the way that I had, I probably would have found myself leaving the hospital and quitting a job. But starting with a job that I already found fulfilling and positive was a help. I didn't have to worry about whether I was in the right place. I was in the right place, but I could improve my workaholic tendencies. Are there any business owners in the house? Yeah, so you know that work can seep into every corner of your life if you allow it to. I vowed that I would not spend time outside of my normal 9 to 5 doing work unless it was something that was absolutely imperative, something that my business had to have from me, or something that I actually found enriching, which is how I stayed coming to Creative Mornings, actually. This would allow me to be present as a parent, but also to have just one tiny bit of a moment back to myself. I vowed to take better care of my body. This body, which has been through so much, has also pumped out another child since then, so extra credit. It's owed some respect. I went through a weird phase where I started taking like every supplement that claims it's good for your brain, and then I realized that was kind of stupid because I couldn't see the day-to-day effect, and also I was getting really obsessive about supplements. So now I just exercise regularly, and I literally feel the difference. Whatever chemicals that triggers, they're better than any supplement you can buy. I take art classes. I drew those pears. Little known fact, I started college as an art major, but I did not have enough confidence in my own future or confidence that I would have a stable income to keep it going. But making art brings me great joy. I am not a designer at stout heart. I'm an account person. I do project management. It also uses a part of my brain that is neglected in my day-to-day life. So when I see lulls in my schedule, or I try to find lulls, I tell my team that I'll be out for a couple hours each week so that I can draw. Above all of those more visible, concrete changes that I've made in my life, I try to be reasonable with my own expectations of myself. We hold ourselves to standards that we would never hold others to. We see Instagram feeds and assume that others have achieved perfection, and comparatively, we have not. We are unfair to ourselves. For the first time in my life, I was able to go to yoga classes without looking at another student and trying to make a competition out of form. 4 years ago, I did not understand what it meant to give myself grace or simply accept. I learned the hard way that you literally don't know what's around the next corner. I'm not here to pat myself on the back either and tell you that I got hit by a car and now I've learned all my life lessons. I have a lot of life left to live, thank goodness. Every year on the anniversary of my brain injury, or what I lovingly call my brainiversary, I go for a long hike by myself. We live in New England. Mid-November is pretty much the worst time to go hiking. It's usually raining or snowing and the leaves are off the trees, so sometimes it's really hard to find the path. But I'm committed to going because I see it as a tribute to my body. Pre-brain injury Mariah would probably be trying to summit a 4,000 footer, posting selfies, and very proud of the end game. Post-brain injury Mariah recognizes that you need to accept where your body is, what the weather's like, and be reasonable about what you're trying to achieve. So this is me on Mount Roberts, this November 13th. I don't know if you can see the water drops on my face or the mascara smudges, but it poured the entire way. And I got to the summit and there were clouds on all sides, no view whatsoever, could not see a thing. And if you want a perfect how it looks on Instagram versus reality meme, here's what was really going on. This is my dog, Truckee, who really hates rain and snow and is barking at me because he does not want to be on the top of a mountain in this moment. But the point of the brainiversary hike isn't the view or even the trophy of making it to the summit. It's that I'm even there in the first place. I've always hated the saying, life is about the journey. It's cheesy, but actually it's true. It's the days that aren't perfect. It's the process. It's the things that you learn along the way. You might be sitting at the top of that mountain and not be able to see a thing for the clouds, but your body was present on this earth, putting one foot in front of the other and got you there. And that in itself is an accomplishment. Acceptance does not have to mean defeat. It can mean simply recognizing where you are on the journey and doing the best you can in that moment. The end.